Hello everyone and welcome to Epilepsy Awareness Expo, and it's official. Today is November 1st and it's Epilepsy Awareness Month. So happy Epilepsy Awareness Month everyone, and thank you for joining us to celebrate. I'm Jana Moore from Epilepsy Support Network of Orange County. We're the welcome wagon booth. We're in the front, the info. You probably talked to us. I'm not going to remember everyone, but I'm so glad you're here to learn about the ketogenic diet. Come on in. We're just getting started. Are you here for the keto diet?
Well, we were going to no, the Dara.
Okay, that's okay. I was thinking she's a little old for the keto. We just signed in with them so that we know them. Okay. So keto diet.
It's one of our nurses.
They're just saying hello.
That was one of our nurses.
I love this enthusiasm, don't you? I do. I love it. We have good attendance. So I want to make sure that everyone's in the right room. We're going to talk about the ketogenic diet for families, children, teens. How far do you go? Adolescents with the ketogenic diet. My daughter was on the ketogenic diet for 2.5 years, so we got everything straightened out, and that was a launching point to move forward with better seizure control and better diagnosis. Welcome. Come on in. Oh, are we saying hello?
That's another nurse.
You know, this is what happens when your speakers are so popular. People just pop in to say hello, and I gotta say I love it. So I'm not
mad.
Let's let it happen, okay? So we want to introduce Sarah Quinn, who's a registered dietitian, and Eliza Reba, who we've worked with for years at the Epilepsy Center, who's a nurse practitioner, and we have an epileptologist in our midst. So I want to say hello and welcome to Dr. Adams. And so I just had to give him a little cue and shout out. I didn't bring the talk to the doc. I'm slipping. We have a talk to the doc coming up, so if you want to talk to him, he'll be there. Stop by our booth. We'll give you the invite. But without further ado, I would like to introduce our speaker who's starting. Okay,
hey,
Sarah?
Yes.
Okay,
Hi.
whether you want to use a microphone or not?
I'll just speak out loud.
Just project that voice on over. And another fan of yours just walked in.
Yes.
Okay.
I'm going to say maybe use the mic because I think that
Okay.
posing is kind of...
Yes. And thank you for coming, and thank you for being here and being a part of the event.
Thanks for all you do.
Okay. Hi, everybody. I'm Sarah, one of the ketogenic dietitians at CHOC, so I'll be starting the presentation today. So today what we will be going over would just be a general overview of the ketogenic diet, the efficacy, and then 2 versions of the diet. So the first one being the classic ketogenic diet, the next one the modified Atkins diet. I do want to note that there are some other ketogenic diets out there, but these are the main 2 that we will be reviewing today, and these are the 2 ones that we do at CHOC. We will also be going over vitamin supplementation and medications, and then finally about how to start a ketogenic diet. So, to start off with, what is the ketogenic diet? In short, it is a high-fat, adequate protein, and a very low-carb diet that is designed to create almost a fasting state that would help produce something called nutritional ketosis. It is a medically supervised diet, so I explain it to my families, treat it as a nutrition prescription, if you will. It is very specific, so you follow a dietitian closely for this. It is an effective treatment for epilepsy, and we do treat infancy through adulthood, so wide range of patients here. We typically talk about the ketogenic diet around after 2 to 3 anti-seizure medications have been trialed and there are difficult to control seizures. And then we do want to note that we just celebrated about 100 years of the ketogenic diet as therapy so far, so we're very excited to continue on with that. So just for juxtaposition of what the ketogenic diet looks like in comparison with the typical American diet, as you can see here, our typical American diet, half of our intake is usually coming from carbs, and then about 30% is coming from fat, and then 20% from protein. In comparison, on the left-hand side, you can see that the classic ketogenic diet, 90% of the diet is coming from fat, only 6% from protein, and 4% from carbs. So you can see how the vast difference in these 2 would really involve almost a nutrition prescription, if you will, when it comes to making sure to keep to those correct proportions. So, I'm going to pass it over to Lisa.
So, when we discuss the efficacy of the diet or how much does the diet work in terms of controlling seizures, we typically refer to kind of the rule of thirds. So, a third of the patients will see greater than 90% reductions in seizures, and of that group, half of those will be seizure-free. Another third will have a greater than 50% reduction in seizures, and then a third really don't see enough benefit to continue, the rigorous diet.
Okay, so the first ketogenic diet that we will be talking about is the classic ketogenic diet. And just as a quick introduction to the diet, one of the biggest concepts we teach are called ketogenic ratios. And if you remember school and everything, when it comes to a ratio, you're taking one number and comparing it to another number. So, for example, if we were doing the classic ketogenic 1-to-1 ratio here, you can see how there's a balance scale, and we have 1 part of fats compared to carbs plus protein. So collectively, carbs plus protein represents that 1. When we go higher on the ratio, so to a 2-to-1 ratio, you can see how the scale tips, and there are now 2 parts of fat in comparison to the collective 1 part of carbs plus 1 part of protein. Same goes for when we go to a 3-to-1 ratio, and then to a 4-to-1 ratio. So what I want to point out here is that a 1-to-1, a 2-to-1, 3-to-1, and 4-to-1, all of those are very common ratios on the ketogenic diet. Sometimes your dietitian will make small changes, so they can make half ratio changes, so for example, a 3.5-to-1 ratio change, or they may make quarter ratio changes, so it may be a 2.25-to-1 ratio change. All of common numbers right there. The other part that I want to point out is when you guys were seeing the animation between the scales, you saw that carbs was decreasing the most. And why we really wanted to point that out here is because when we're making those ratio changes and we're getting to that 90% of the diet coming from fat, we ultimately will be reducing that collective carb plus protein, but we never want to provide under the amount of protein that a child needs or a patient needs to maintain their lean body mass, or even to help with growing for children. So that's why we wanted to really show that carbs is the ultimate one that we reduce here. So what do these meals look like at these different ratios? Here we have a picture. I know it is quite small, so please focus on that little box right here. And this meal right here is depicting a 400-calorie meal. It is at a ketogenic 1-to-1 ratio, and you can see the macronutrient distribution right here. So you can see already at a 1-to-1 ratio, half of that intake is coming from fat, a large portion is coming from protein, and then only a small part is coming from carbs. This particular meal includes 95 grams of broccoli, 75 grams of chicken breasts, 35 grams of green olives, 2 grams of parsley, 22 grams of mayo, and 5 grams of olive oil. So, lots of numbers here. We'll explain it more in detail, but ultimately when we go up to a 2-to-1 ratio, so in this picture right here, you can see the macronutrient distribution changed, and now we're around 2/3 of the particular meal coming from fat, protein reduced, and carbs reduced. Ingredients changed here to reflect those macronutrient changes. Same goes when we go to a 3-to-1 ratio here. So you can now see 75% of that particular meal is coming from fat, protein reduced, and carbs reduced. You can also see that the ingredients list did change slightly. They did remove parsley here, and they changed some of the different ingredients to reduce that carb amount and that protein amount in that particular meal. Finally, when we get to a 4-to-1 ratio, now you can see more of that classic ketogenic pie chart that we saw earlier, where majority of the diet is coming from fat, there is a reduced amount of protein, and ultimately carbs has the smallest number. If you guys can see all of the pictures, food pictures right here, you can also see how visually, sometimes at a 1-to-1 ratio, that meal does look different than the 4-to-1 ratio, and the 1-to-1 ratio meal may look smaller or bigger. And the reason being is because fat is a very calorically dense food group. So what that means is that there are more calories per gram when it comes to fat in comparison to carbs and protein. So hence why all of these meals have the same amount of calories, but ultimately this meal may look smaller because there's a majority of the diet is coming from fat versus over here where there were more carbs allotted, so there's more volume from the broccoli. So another big concept that we teach when it comes to the classic ketogenic diet is weighing food. And weighing food is very important for the classic ketogenic diet. We do ask all of our families to use gram scales when it comes to this. And basically, they will measure all of the ingredients that are going into that particular ketogenic meal and weigh it on a gram scale. We do ask families to be very precise in their measurements. So we do ask them to measure using the 10th decimal place. So on here, on this particular picture, you can see that there are a couple strawberries and they are weighing that. When we zoom in, you can see that that number here says 52.0 with a G on top. And what that really translates to is we are making sure that we are in the correct unit, so in grams. And then we see that decimal point with a 0 after, representing that 10th decimal place. So we are making sure to measure with 1 decimal point afterwards. We teach our families about rounding. So if that number is reading 0.5 or more, we ask our families to round up to the next whole number. So here, for example, if this read 52.7 grams, then we would round up to 53 grams. Likewise, if it was reading 0.4 or lower, we would round down to the whole number that is represented on the scale. So if this read 52.3 grams, then we would make sure to round down to 52 grams. So what does all of this mean when it comes to keto-friendly foods versus not keto-friendly foods? So some food examples on the ketogenic diet would include great fat sources. So here we have cheese, we have sour cream, avocado, and oil. I would like to put a pitch for avocado because it is ultimately our favorite ketogenic food group because it does actually, all of the macronutrients equivalent to a 4-to-1 ratio. So it is the perfect ketogenic food. It is our star player in the ketogenic world. And then some good proteins that we would add here. So you can see bacon, chicken, and hot dogs. And then we would add some carb sources here. So the carbs that would be keto-friendly would be leafy greens, broccoli, celery sticks, carrot sticks, and some berries. On the not-so-keto-friendly side, I wanted to start off with some vegetables that we all are familiar with. So these are all starchy vegetables, and that includes corn, beans, peas, and potatoes or french fries. And then we do have all of our sweets listed here. So we have ice cream, cookies, and breakfast cereals. We'd also are not so keto friendly would be our breads and pastas, and then some beverages such as milk and juice. So when it comes to the next ketogenic diet we want to talk about, it is called Modified Atkins Diet. It is also abbreviated MAD, if you guys see that term. This diet was created by Johns Hopkins, and basically it was made to make a less restrictive version of the ketogenic diet while still promoting nutritional ketosis. So by less restrictive, families are not using gram scales. They are only counting the carbs, and typically that carb restriction is between 10 to 30 grams of carbs per day. When it comes to how much carbs are allotted between that 10 to 30 grams of carbs, typically for our children, we are starting them at between 10 to 15 grams of carbs. And then for our adolescents, we are starting them between 15 to 20 grams of carbs. Usually we ask our families to try this out, give it a month at that carb restriction. And then if the patient is tolerating that carb amount well, then we could add small increments of carbs back in up to that 30 grams of carb by 5-gram carb increments. We usually backtrack if seizure frequency increases or there are other side effects that the parents are noticing. And again, this is a less restrictive diet, so in this world and age where we have great technology, there are also great phone apps available that can help track macronutrients or carbs. So we usually recommend our families to download those. And then they can also use household measuring utensils. So again, they're not having to use a gram scale when it comes to modified Atkins diets. They can use measuring cups, tablespoons, teaspoons, and all of those measuring utensils. And ultimately, the diet, even though it is a little bit more liberal, it still is here to promote ketosis. From the modified Atkins diet, there is now a newer version that is similar to modified Atkins, but instead of just counting carbs, you're also counting the protein and fat. So instead of your nutrition prescription just being a carb restriction, you would be given a ultimate goal for the fat, protein, and carbs. This one is called modified keto. Some families like this version, some families don't like counting as much, so we really work with families to see what works best for their lifestyle and what families feel comfortable with. So, biggest important part about the modified Atkins diet is tracking the carbs. So we teach our families about tracking their net carbs, and we also make a disclaimer that if there are food labels that say sugar-free or no sugar added, unfortunately that does not mean carb-free. I have had families talk to me about sugar-free prune juice, and ultimately what that means is that there was no sugar added to the prune juice, but the prune juice still did have a ton of carb in it. So when we talk about net carbs at CHOC, we have this equation right here, and basically what it says is we define net carbs as the total carbohydrates minus fiber and minus a sugar alcohol called erythritol. And we are very specific about which sugar alcohol we are subtracting from, because other sugar alcohols do contribute and are metabolized to some extent, and the one that doesn't get metabolized as much is called erythritol. When we talk about an example here, so I have a nutrition facts label, and in this example we'll figure out how much net carbs are in it per serving. So if you take a look at it, you can see that in purple there's the total carbs labeled, and that's 22 grams. And then if you subtract the fiber, which is labeled right underneath, here it's labeled as dietary fiber, that is depicted as 10 grams. And then there is a area in green where it is marked as erythritol on the food label, and that one is 8 grams. So collectively, you can see here that per serving of this nutrition facts label, there are 4 grams of net carb. I will note sometimes it is labeled as erythritol here, but sometimes it is labeled as sugar alcohol. So that's when it comes to taking a look at the ingredients label, seeing what other sugar substitute there is. If it's sorbitol or a different one, then duly note that you cannot subtract out that sugar alcohol. We can only subtract out erythritol. So let's say if we were building a modified Atkins meal together on a particular app, you can see here that we would first add a good protein source. So here we added 1 hot dog, and you can see the net carbs, protein, and fat with the meal totals at the bottom. So then after adding a good protein, perhaps we would add some cheese, which would add some good fat and some good protein. And then from there we add a good fat source. So here we would add some butter. Here we added 2 tablespoons of butter. And then finally we would add a nice carb source, and here we chose broccoli. So here this collective meal would be 1 hot dog, 1.5 tablespoons of cheese, 2 tablespoons of butter, and a 1/3 cup of broccoli, with the ultimate macronutrient goals totals of 45 grams of fat, 8 grams of protein, and 3 grams of net carbs. This is a perfect example if a particular patient was on, let's say, a 10-gram carb restriction, then this would easily divide into about 3 meals per day. So a lot of families do ask me, okay, Sarah, you tell me about a carb restriction, but how do we ultimately get that fat in? So one of the biggest concepts we teach is called a fat bomb. This is not a new concept. It's been a very trendy concept amongst the keto world, but basically it is a way to create a snack or a treat that gets in a good amount of fat, and it is very low carb. So the goal ultimately for fat bombs is per serving we are aiming for around 10 grams of fat with less than 1 gram of carb. Really, we rely on parents and families to use their creativity when it comes to this, and work with the particular patient and what they like and their food preferences. So you can see here we just celebrate Halloween, so I had to put this in. Here you can see mascarpone or cream cheese ghosts that were flavored with some, I think, pumpkin spice seasoning, and then they put on some keto-friendly chocolate chips to make it into a ghost. And then in this other picture here, you can see mascarpone pistachio truffles, where they use mascarpone cheese as the base, as the fat source, and they crusted it with pistachios to add a little bit of a texture. And then in the bottom picture right there, you would see the classic coconut oil fat bombs, where it's a base of coconut oil mixed with a little bit of sugar-free sweetener and a little bit of cocoa, put into a silicone mold, and then it pops out as that. And the ultimate generic recipe is using a good fat source, flavoring it with different spices, with different extracts, your favorite sugar-free sweetener, and then adding a texture on top of that to add a little bit more fun to it. So another example would be using a base of cream cheese and then adding some sugar-free sweetener to it, and then adding some chopped almonds over the top. You can even go fancy and add some cinnamon into the mix if you really want to. So, least to say, we want you guys, the biggest takeaway is that keto kids and keto patients can eat. And here we have some fun pictures that some of our dietitians have created and some of our families have submitted to us. You can see here that keto kids can eat holiday food. They can eat their own versions of pizza. They can eat carbs. So here we have an egg-based waffle. And then even school lunches or lunches on the go. So, if your patient or your family member is drinking formula or is feeding tube dependent, there are a lot of products on the market too. Here you can see there's a variety of different formulas. They do have a peptide-based formula on the market, and then they have unflavored versions, which are similar to more of a milky flavor. We also have vanilla flavors out there, chocolate flavors, and more recently this past year, they actually released a plant-based vanilla ketogenic shake. So many options out there when it comes to keto formulas. There are also liquid versions and powdered versions, depending what the family prefers. And then if your family member is using blenderized feedings, there is a commercial ketogenic product on the market that is a blenderized food in a pouch. And then here you can see there are syringes with some blenderized food. So we want to point out that you are able to work with a ketogenic dietitian to create your own blends at home if that's the way that you want to go for the nutrition. So next I would like to review some vitamins, supplements, and medications. So for vitamins and supplements, the reason why we spend so much time on this is because if you remember that pie graph at the beginning, with 90% of the diet coming from fat and only 4% from carbs, ultimately when we take a look at carbs, we're having our fruits, our vegetables, and our fortified grains. When we reduce that amount to that 4 or 5%, we are losing the ability to have all of those vitamins and minerals in the diet. So that's why we have to add them back in. Also why you work closely with the dietitian. So typically, all of our patients are started on baseline of multivitamin. Sometimes they are started on extra vitamin D and calcium. Vitamin D, especially if the multivitamin is not meeting the baseline needs, or some of the medications can reduce vitamin D levels too, so that's something we do monitor over time. And then calcium, just in case if that multivitamin isn't having enough calcium to support the patient's needs for their age. Another supplement that we may add is called carnitine, and carnitine is an essential nutrient that is used to help make sure that fat goes where it needs to go so that it can be broken down into the ketones and be used for energy. So it is a very important part of the diet, and when we're asking patients to make 90% of their diet coming from fat, we want to make sure that they have enough carnitine to be able to process the fat to make enough of their own energy as ketones. Another supplement we might add would be called sodium bicarbonate or citrates. Another name for sodium bicarbonate is baking soda, and by baking soda I mean the baking soda you find in your local grocery store. We use these because in general when we're promoting ketosis, it could make the body a little bit more acidic, and we need to help the body balance it out. So these are the ingredients that we can help the body balance out that acidic nature. Another supplement we might add is called MCT oil. And MCT oil is another fat-based supplement, and it is used to increase ketosis. And the reason why it can help increase ketosis is because it actually can produce more ketones per gram than our typical regular oil, so such as canola oil, avocado oil, or olive oil. And then finally, another couple of supplements we might add would be called soluble fiber or omega-3, omega-3 being the one that you find in fish oil. We would use these to not only help correct lipid panels, so if there's elevated triglycerides, elevated LDL or cholesterol, these two supplements can help out with that, or soluble fiber can be even used to help with constipation. I also like to take the time to point out that there is a massive list of hidden carbohydrates when it comes to the ketogenic diet and what we consider a carb. So more specifically, it is made to be an overwhelming list of different ingredients, but pointing out a couple here. Here we have citric acid and cornstarch. Both of these are very common in different food products that you find on the market, so both of these are considered carbs. We also have sorbitol and xylitol. Both of these are very common sugar-free substitutes, so being mindful that these do contribute in the metabolism and they are metabolized. And then in the medication world, glycerin and mannitol both contain carbs to some extent, so being mindful of that when it comes to the medications, especially when you're working with your doctor to make sure that they are on a keto-friendly formulation. So now I will pass it over to Lisa.
So in an ongoing attempt to minimize carbohydrates, one of the first steps that we take when a patient starts on the diet is to change all their medications that may be in a liquid form to a tablet or capsule. This is because your liquid medications are sweetened with a sugar that makes it taste sweet. So unfortunately, those have to go by the wayside. And we end up, for our little patients, the kids that can't swallow, we either crush the tablets into like avocado or sour cream, or if they have capsules, you can do the same thing, open that up and sprinkle it into a keto-friendly food. We also provide all of our patients who are on the diet with a letter to be used in the event of an emergency. So if the patient arrives in an urgent care center, an emergency room, or are admitted to a hospital, they have this letter that informs the provider that they're on a ketogenic diet and certain things to look out for and just to be aware of. So for example, lab values for a child or an adult on a diet will be very different than lab values of a healthy patient. So their glucose will be much lower than a healthy person, and their ketones will be much higher. We have parameters that are entirely acceptable for our patients, and we want to make sure that the provider won't treat hypoglycemia or metabolic acidosis unless it's truly indicated. We also provide guidance for IV fluids. So if a patient comes in dehydrated or and needs IV fluids, we want to make sure there aren't any hidden sources of carbohydrates in that, so no dextrose. Again, unless it's medically indicated, in which case, no means. So, as Sarah mentioned, typically we start thinking about the ketogenic diet as a possible treatment for patients that have failed 2 or more anti-seizure medications. There are certain conditions or diagnoses for which we start maybe thinking about that earlier. So the first table highlights some conditions and diagnoses for which there's significant data to suggest a more robust response to treatment with the diet. The second table is a list of conditions for which patients have certainly demonstrated response to treatment, perhaps not as much data to suggest the response that we see from the first table. So a lot of information on this. A few things I point out. So for example, right here it says formula-fed children or infants. Obviously that's not a condition that necessarily says I have intractable epilepsy. But these patients tend to do better because you're literally just giving them a formula. So like she showed, we have these boxes of formula, and it's just so much easier to do. As we get older and we have teens or even just toddlers that can roam around to the kitchen and open up a cabinet and grab a cookie, it just gets harder for that diet to be effective. It's not to say that we can't. We certainly have teens and there's certainly adults on the diet. It's just so much easier when you have an infant that's not mobile, and it's easier to just give formula. But anyways, a lot of patients can benefit. The opposite end of the spectrum, we also have patients for which the diet is contraindicated or could pose a risk to their health. So these are primarily patients that have metabolic conditions where their bodies can't break down that fat. So if you're giving a high amount of fat, a large amount of fat, their bodies can't break it down, and that can pose a threat to their health. So these are listed here. So therefore, before starting anyone on the diet, we always run metabolic screening tests to make sure they don't have any of these conditions. At the same time, we also obtain baseline labs to help us assess kind of what supplements we anticipate they'll be needing on the diet. So Sarah had discussed there are a bunch of supplements we may consider. So this test kind of gives us a guideline for if and when we start the diet, are we going to have to add in the calcium, vitamin D, or whatever to help maintain just an overall health and wellness. So at CHOC, the first step in starting the ketogenic diet is to first come to our keto clinic, where you meet with the dietitians, with the nurse practitioner. We have a social worker and a pharmacist to kind of go over A, what makes a candidate for the diet, and B, what's involved with the diet. We want to set our patients and families up for success, and we want to make sure it's a good match. There's a lot involved in maintaining the diet, and we don't want families to jump into the process not fully understanding what's involved. So during that course of that appointment, we decide whether or not this is something we want to go ahead with. If the decision is then made to start the diet, for the classic keto diet, we admit our patients to the hospital. And typically we anticipate a 3 to 5 day stay at the hospital. During that time, we typically do video EEG monitoring for the first 24 hours. And that's to be used as a baseline assessment so that we can look at the number of seizures they're having, maybe the duration of seizures that they're having, and use that as a comparison perhaps 6 months down the road for us to assess whether the diet's helping or not. We also obtain labs daily just to make sure everything's trending in the right direction. We want to see that your glucose is going down, your ketones are going up, and there aren't any changes that may be causing side effects. Also on a daily basis, you're meeting with the dietitians, the nurse practitioners, the epileptologist, the pharmacist comes around, and the social worker, just to provide education to set you up for success on the diet, and also to answer any questions or concerns you may have throughout the stay. We typically start the first day on a 1-to-1 ratio, and then as tolerated, we go up to a 2-to-1, a 3-to-1, a 4-to-1, depending on what ratio is already determined by the team. We typically have an idea what ratio would be appropriate for the patient before we get started, based on the overall protein needs, calorie needs, and age of the child. The MAD diet is typically started as an outpatient, but still that we follow these patients with labs and routine clinical visits and keep in close contact, but it's certainly not as rigorous as our traditional ketogenic diet. Just like medications, the ketogenic diet certainly has potential side effects associated with it. Since the diet's been around for over 100 years, we have a pretty good understanding of the potential side effects, how to monitor for them, and how to treat them if they should occur. So some of these include hypercholesterolemia, so elevated cholesterol, which Sarah mentioned we typically just treat with fish oil. Bone health, so sometimes you may see fractures if we're not monitoring the bone health appropriately, so we typically do what we can to prevent that. Kidney stones, typically the best prevention for that is just adequate hydration. And constipation, again, adequate hydration is your best friend, but also things like Miralax or milk of magnesia. And so throughout the whole process, we monitor, as we were saying, we monitor labs, both to look for potential side effects, but also just to make sure that we are trending correctly on the diet. So the first thing is we have urine sticks to monitor ketones. So after the patient is discharged from the hospital, we monitor ketones twice daily for the first month. And then if there are any sort of dietary changes, so if we start tweaking the ratio a little bit, we'd start checking those ketones again, just making sure that they're going up. And then if there's any change in the status of the patient, if the patient all of a sudden has more seizures for any kind of unclear reason, if they're lethargic, if they're vomiting, we want to check to see what their ketones look like. We also monitor blood labs, so typically that's a month after you're discharged from the hospital, then every 3 months for the first year, and every 6 months thereafter. And then in between, again, if there's any change in status, so more seizures or any side effects. We also see our patients kind of on about that same schedule. So the first month after starting the diet, every 3 months thereafter, and then for the first year, and then every 6 months thereafter. During the clinic visits, we discuss your seizure activity. Are you seeing any improvement in your seizure activity? We review the lab results to see if there's anything that needs to be addressed, any side effects a patient may be having. We assess the growth parameters, make sure our children are growing both in height and weight appropriately. I know a lot of people think of the ketogenic diet as a means of losing weight, but that's not at all the goal for us, especially since we're a pediatric center. We want our children to be gaining weight, and that's why what our dietitians do is so important. And then our dietitians will also help kind of tweak the diet, so both for seizure control, but also just for palatability of the diet. So if we have an oral feeder, we want to make sure they're having more interesting recipes, not just the same thing day after day. So they work tremendously closely with the families to make sure they have recipes that are interesting. Some patients may see effects from the diet as soon as like a few weeks after starting, but some may take 2 or 3 months to see results from the diet. So because of that, we typically ask our patients to give us a 3-month commitment before deciding whether or not to continue on the diet or not. If there's no improvement after the first 3 months, we'll typically wean off it over the course of about 3 days. But if there's an improvement in seizures, we'll typically continue for about another 2 or 3 years. At that time, we'll gradually wean off over the course of a few weeks or even a few months. The diet is different from medications in many ways, but one of the more interesting ways is that typically if you're on a medication and you come off, you would expect to start seeing your seizures again. For some reasons that we don't fully understand, with the ketogenic diet, typically once you come off the diet, your degree of seizure control remains. So 80% of patients who have achieved seizure freedom on the diet, once they wean off, will maintain their seizure freedom despite coming off the diet. Of those 20% who have a seizure recurrence, we would restart the diet and hopefully gain control again. All this to say, we realize it's a super complicated process. It's not easy. It may seem overwhelming because that we have a huge team to support you. So the neurologists, the nurse practitioners, and the pharmacists all review your seizure activity with you, medications, making sure you're not having side effects, make sure that your medications are keto compliant, they're not giving too many carbs. We have the dietitians who, again, monitoring the growth parameters, make sure you're not getting too much weight, too little weight, make sure you're growing appropriately, make sure you have recipes that meet this prescription that we prescribe, the prescribed ratio, and just ensuring overall nutritional health. We have a social worker on our team who makes sure our patients have the adequate resources and supplies needed to maintain the diet, make sure that they have the keto strips or just the social support that they need. And most importantly, we view the family as a key component of the team, and not just the parents, not just the child themselves or the patient, but also the siblings, the grandparents, anyone else who's involved with the child, because it's a tremendous endeavor, and the family really provides the foundation for the support on the diet. So what is next? The first step would obviously be to ask your provider, if the keto diet is appropriate for you. The diet absolutely requires close medical monitoring, so it's not something we would want anyone to go out and do on their own. However, we do recommend checking out the charliefoundation.org to see if this is something that might be of interest to you. They have wonderful recipes. They also provide a list of centers throughout the country that can support you in starting the ketogenic diet. And there are numerous other resources out, but this is a good start. And with that, we'll open up for questions if there are any.
How do you check the urine twice daily?
Yeah. So for I'll say a large majority of our patients are babies. Like we were saying, it's so easy with the formula. So in that case, for our parents, we'll put like cotton balls in the diaper and collect urine and squeeze it into a test tube, and it's a keto strip. It's like a urine strip, and you would just dip that in the urine to test it. And then adult, as yourself, or you would just kind of pee on the strip, or if a child could pee into a cup and dip it, just like what you've done at a doctor's office to test your urine.
Is insurance something that helps with this?
Absolutely, and that's why our social worker is a huge component of the team. So yeah, so sometimes it's a struggle, but I don't think we've ever not been able to get covered. So, for example, the formula gets covered by insurance, the keto strips get covered by insurance, obviously the hospitalization gets covered by insurance. What's not forgetting? Labs.
I think that's some of the vitamins sometimes.
Some of the vitamins.
Mm-hmm.
Some not so much.
My son is autistic,
Mm-hmm.
so he's not verbal.
Yeah.
He's unable to communicate. So any question you have to go to the other.
Yeah.
So just, what is it again? He has inflammation of the intestine.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know how he will do with the vegetables. I don't know if he eats vegetables. He will do vegetables.
Vegetables make it worse. Yeah. Well, first thing I would say, discuss it with your provider. As we said, constipation is a major side effect of the diet, so typically it's nice to kind of sort out any GI issues you have before starting the diet, because I don't know if the constipation would further exacerbate the issues that he already has. In terms of just having a child with autism, it can be helpful or not. So in general, children with autism typically tend to be picky eaters and have like certain things that they will or will not eat. That can work to our advantage or not, because some kids, like if it's just dipping a hot dog in mayonnaise, like that's fantastic. Like we could do that every day, all day. So it depends, if he really only likes eating pizza, that's going to be a little bit harder. But, definitely something you could work with.
And
Oh, please.
there's a ton of keto recipes out there. I really highly recommend checking out the Charlie Foundation. The creativity has expanded. The community for keto has expanded too. And really, when you start the diet, because it is a medically supervised diet, you will be working closely with the dietitian. And I promise you, they have all the creative tools to work with you to really try to feel out what does your son need and how can we make it keto friendly and how can we work it out with you guys. Yeah. Any other questions?
All right, thanks so much.
Thank you guys.